when I went to this big rally. There was about 500 people there, and they were mostly workers at Alaska Airlines, kind of baggage handlers and airplane fuelers, and folks that did the wheelchairs through the hospital, and they all worked for Alaska Airlines, although as subcontractors. This big rally was because they were being paid basically below minimum wage, and they were asking for some protections on the job, and they're getting really mistreated. It was so bad that the turnover rate for these jobs, and there's about 4,000 of them, was 6 months. I mean, it was just a constant turnover. The vast majority were people of color, immigrants, refugees. So this is the population that was there. There's about 500 people there, and I went as kind of representative of Valley Mountain because we've been working alongside communities in that area for a while, kind of trying to support the agenda to be heard by their bosses. And they've been through all this process of trying to get heard, and they were just getting shut down at every turn. And so finally we were doing stuff like this big rally right out front of the headquarters of Alaska Airlines. And so I show up, and I got my collar on, and I'm ready to be part of the 500-person march and rally. And somebody there was like, "Oh, good. Would you lead the rally and bang on the doors of the headquarters?" And I was like, you know, I had never done anything like that before. I mean, even just showing up was a little bit of a stretch for me at that time. And I just was totally freaked out. They're like, you seem like you know how to public speak. And I was like, this is back before Valley Mountain had weekly services. I was like, I don't actually do this for me. But I had to kind of own it and walk with it and say yes. And so I was put in the front of this group, and we had this big rally and there's speeches and stuff, and then they're like, we're gonna march on the building, and you know, Pastor's gonna lead us. And so I'm at the front of this group, and all these people are behind me, and we walk up to the headquarters, and there's a big parking lot in front of Alaska Airlines headquarters, and there's a security guard, and he's standing there like this. And I start walking, I'm in the front, and we have this list of demands, and he's like, you can't go in here. And I was like, oh, I guess we can't go in there. And I stopped, but the people kept walking around me, like, you know, like they were a little wave. And I was like, oh, and they just kept walking. I was like, I think we can go in here. So I just kind of walked by, and he was like, okay. And so it was this profound, and then I banged on the door, and these people came down. It was like the VP of PR, like public relations or something like this. And we're like, we want the CEO to come out now and like address the crowd and like give in to us. And they're like, we're not going to do that. But they actually said, you know, well, you and a couple people can come in and we'll talk to you. And I was like, I don't, is that what we do here? And everybody was like, no, it's not. You talk to us, or we're going to just rally out here for more, and we're going to come back later, because we don't want a few people coming into your back room somewhere and making some deal that we don't know about and we haven't authorized. I mean, that might be a place where you could get to, where we've all come to the table and like heard what your terms are, but this just feels really, really fishy. So that was the experience, and I kind of walked away from it. And we kept on rallying, and the truth is that these thousands of employees, this was like 4 years ago, have now entirely been unionized. Their wages are above minimum wage. They have job protections. They've been given back pay for all their like underpayment. I mean, Natalie's been part of this. A bunch of other amazing things have happened, all because I knocked on the door. Totally a joke. All because of the work of these workers, the incredible courage of these people who said no to the injustice that had been perpetrated on them for years and years and years and years. And I was aware in that moment, as I stopped in front of this single security guard with 500 people at my back, of how programmed I was by the society and the culture, a dominant culture in the United States that says somebody with power says no, you obey. You can't break the rules. They have the power, and you must do what they say. And I think so many of us are trained to feel that we are not authorized. I mean, even just like, okay, you're going to lead this march, you're knocking on the door. I was okay to be in the back of that crowd, but I did not feel authorized to speak to powerful people and say what I thought, even though I really believed it was right. And I believe that empires train us to feel unauthorized to speak up. And this is beginning to change. I mean, there's always been pockets of people that have refused to do this, and we should honor and celebrate their legacy. But there is more and more awareness of this. We see this with the Me Too campaign, with the awakening of voices, just countless stories. I mean, it's heartbreaking and enraging. And yet at the same time, it's been going on. And so it's time for people to start standing up. And it's been a long time for people to start standing up. And so we're seeing that folks are beginning to speak up who have suffered abuse quietly for years and years and years. People are beginning to feel authorized, and it is changing the world we live in. I gave a workshop, as Neil mentioned earlier yesterday, to, I guess it was 180 people or something like that. A bunch of United Methodist churches sent pastors and anybody from the churches or leaders who wanted to go to Kent United Methodist, so Tacoma and Seattle, the I-5 corridor. People gathered together for a day-long workshop. And I got to have an hour to talk about the table turning activities that we do. So if you're not familiar with this, we celebrate Jesus turning the tables in the temple every year, which is a story in the Bible where it happened just 3 days before he gets arrested by the empire and executed with the death of somebody who was disobedient to authority. So the cross was not something you get put on for, not paying your taxes right or for stealing something. It's for somebody who was an insurrectionist, to publicly humiliate and strike fear into other people who would disrupt the power system. So 3 days before that happens, Jesus goes into the center of Jerusalem on the busiest tourist weekend of the year, or the tourist week of the year, the Passover week, into the place that was the economic engine of this city, and disrupts commerce. It was not just a religious doctrine dispute about what doves should be in the temple and all this kind of thing. This was a challenge to the system as it was. The political system, the rulers, the elites, what they had set up. And so 3 days later, he gets this punishment. So we think that's an important part of the story, and somehow it's like never talked about. We celebrate Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry, Jesus going into Jerusalem. And we celebrate Maundy Thursday, which is the day where the communion was started. Like Jesus first did the bread and the blood, or the bread, the wine, the cup, the thing. And we celebrate Good Friday, the day he was crucified, and Easter. But part of that week in the Bible story is him going into the temple and turning the tables over. And for some reason, the institutional church hasn't decided to talk about it. That's me. So we talk about, we celebrate this by doing a social justice action, going to some site and location of power and oppression, as we understand it, and going and saying we think this is wrong and trying to do something about it. We've in recent years gotten increasingly kind of aware that we are also part of the bigger system, and we are calling ourselves out, many of us anyway, are calling ourselves out as we turn the tables on these powers. So we try to go in confessionally with humility rather than with self-righteous, you're wrong, we're right. Some people that's appropriate for, but for some of us, we're actually part of the system. So I gave this workshop about this, and I broke people up into groups and asked them to, in small groups, come up with a social justice action and what they could do about it. And some folks did, and then I had some time for people to share, and then afterwards people shared what their ideas were with me. And it wasn't a lot of time, but what I noticed is that most of the groups came up with things like this. So one group said, in a small town, there's new parking fees at the local park, and there used to be free parking. And I'm like, well, that's not, okay, and that's a start. And I said, we think this is wrong. And I thought this was, pretty good thinking. He's like, it's a barrier for people who don't have a few bucks. And it's true, that is a barrier. You can't go to the park anymore if you don't have an extra few dollars in your pocket. And I'm so, okay, now we're talking. So what do you want to do? Trying to go and smash the parking meters? No. We're gonna get some people together and we'll go talk to a city council person about changing the policy. And honestly, that's probably a good first step. You don't want to just smash the parking meter in the first. I don't think that's good escalation tactics. You got to start lower so you can go somewhere. And so it was actually appropriate thinking, but I noticed that most of the ideas in the room were similar to that. The solution was we should go talk to a politician and tell them that they should change the rules. And we'll set up a meeting with the mayor, and that's what we'll do. And I think that this is, once again, it's probably appropriate to have these stair-step things, but we are programmed to think if there's a change that needs to happen, the best we can do is go to somebody with power and ask them to change it for us. We have been trained to feel unauthorized, to take up our own power. I think that part of this is the fault of Christianity. As I said, the table-turning story has been basically erased from the story of Jesus and the institutional church anyway. And the images that we get of Jesus are very apolitical. It's like he has no agenda, like he has no real concern with the world as it is other than your heart and coming into your heart and making you a good person and get saved. And those are great things, but that's not the whole story. So basically it seems to me that in mainstream Christianity there's two versions of Jesus. There's Jesus the soldier of empire, the one who is on the side of whoever is in charge and comes behind him. There's this amazing right-wing painter who does these watercolors, and he's got this new one out, it's really amazing, of Oval Office desk, Trump's at the desk, and Jesus has his arms around him and is helping him sign the documents with that real signature. And it is as though Trump is this sort of the agent of Christ, and Christ is sort of really just acting through him like a channel. And that's actually what like millions of people believe. That is a philosophy that is being sold on talk radio and in magazines and websites all the time. And so we have that one, and then a bunch of people, and I can see the cringes all over the crowd. It's like so Barbie face, like horrible. So, you know, there's that. But then the alternative seems to be the picture of Jesus who's just like the buddy Jesus, you know, this guy. He's got a fishing net over his shoulder and he's smiling and he's like, come on everybody, let's have some pancakes, you know? Let's just all hang out and be nice to each other and be gentle and friendly and fun. And that's kind of what like the liberal church is. It's like Jesus is a really nice guy and we should be nice too. And we should talk about how peace is better than war and whatnot, but for the most part, the goal is to be kind. And kindness is a virtue, and like, I'm all for kindness over meanness. But the guy who chased the money changers out of the temple, you don't get crucified for telling everybody to be really nice. So we have the soldier, Christ the soldier, Christ the submissive one, who's this kind of buddy Jesus, who's disconnected from the empire and the politics of the day. And if Christianity is something that has nothing to say about politics, it's basically submitting to it, because you side with the oppressor if you don't have an opinion in a power imbalance. So we have Christ the soldier of empire, Christ submissive to empire, but then there's Christ subversive to empire. And this is a story and a concept and philosophy, a theology that has been part of the story since the very beginning, but has always been kind of an underground one. It's been pushed underground. You find it much stronger in the Black church in America. You find it much stronger in Latin American, certain Latin American churches and churches in Africa. But in places of wealth and power, it is few and far between. But I believe it has been always part of the story. So the scripture we heard today in very old-timey language is amazing. It's kind of fun. We don't usually say unto around here, but it's cool. I think it just means two, right? Well, in case like you didn't understand what was said, the story is this guy Nathan, who's a prophet in Israel. This is like 3,000 years ago. So imagine about 900 years before Christ, so 900 BC or BCE. And there was a king named David, and he ruled over Israel. And for each king at this time, there was a prophet. Or there was usually many prophets, but there was one prophet who was the thorn on the side. And this is basically like every single king had somebody who was doing this to them. And the prophet of David, at his same time, was named Nathan. And so Nathan is seeing David doing all these unjust things in the world and cruel things, and he's like, you know, arranging deaths of people so they can take their wives and take their land. And this is, the Old Testament's like really interesting stories. It's really racy stuff sometimes. So this king is doing these unjust things. Nathan approaches him and tells him this parable about like the sweet little lamb who's like raised with a milk bottle, you know, the poor man raises the milk bottle and he's got this thing. And then this guy with like thousands of lambs, and someone comes to the house, and the rich man, the law of the land was to be hospitable to a stranger, so he has to give him some food, but instead of using one of his thousands of lambs, he goes and takes the lamb from the poor guy, because he knows he can't do anything about it, and kills it, slaughters it, and makes a feast out of it. And David is enraged by the injustice of this, and the man shall be killed. And then Nathan does the awesome prophet thing of, well, you're the man. It's like, oh no, and he weeps, and the story goes on to talk about how bad he feels about it. But there's a line in there, and the last verse of that passage that Natalie read that you might have missed, where Nathan says, I have anointed you to King David. And so the anointing was a process of putting oil on the head of a king or a prophet. A prophet would anoint the king. And that was basically authorizing the king, giving the king authority. But the authority was conditional. The authority was something that you had to the degree that you were going to practice the laws of justice and mercy and compassion and listening. And so Nathan is calling out this king because they had this relationship, and because he's asking him to remember that he has power, but it is conditional power. It is power that can be revoked, and power that is to be used for good, and that he has misused this power. Now, prophets were the other group of people in ancient Israel who would get anointed, who would get oil on their heads. And their calling was basically, if you were a prophet and you got anointed, what it was saying is you were obedient not to the king, but to a higher authority, to God. And so it was this kind of political system where there was somebody in power who wasn't actually supposed to be threatened by the king. It was kind of like the Department of Justice, I think. I don't really understand. But like some other body that can call out the people in charge to act as a check and a balance. And so there's two groups of people that were anointed in ancient Israel. Does anybody know what the word Messiah means? Messiah. I know some of y'all know this.
Savior?
Not quite.
Messenger.
Messenger. It is kind of like messenger.
Oh, like.
But literally, Messiah means anointed one. Somebody who has been anointed. And so they're anointed with a message. So Messiah, which is translated in Greek, Christ, is somebody who has been anointed. And so this Jesus character is somebody who has been anointed like a prophet to speak truth to power. And so somehow this has been erased, forgotten, stolen, intentionally, covered up by the institutions of religion to make Jesus into this kind of totally independent, individualistic messenger type guy. But he was one who was anointed to call truth to power. Now, interestingly enough, the word Christian means little. The Ian means, at the end of Christ, means little. So, little Christ. Little anointed ones. People who are following in that way, people who are supposed to be like that, and who are actually anointed. And by the 2nd century, we have records in the very, very beginning of the movement of Jesus getting some real organization and coming together. To enter into the community was to be anointed. It was actually part of the process. We still do that today with baptism. You're anointed after you get baptized. And so in the beginning, this movement was one that was challenging the structures. People couldn't serve in the Roman imperial army. People couldn't be part of some of these banking systems. There were these actual safeguards against participation in injustice and oppression that they believed in at the time. And they enforced, and that continued throughout time. In the early Methodist Church, people had to give up their slaves if they had slaves. They couldn't have it, and that got muddied and was changed over time, tragically. Now, I think as we begin to think of ourselves, hopefully, whether or not you use the word Christian to describe yourself, which I realize is like a really complicated, really messy word that a lot of people don't want anything to do with, and that's fine. But to be in this tradition of calling out truth to power, to be in the tradition of a prophetic standing up, is to be anointed. But I think it's really interesting to imagine that when we are anointed, we are not just anointed as prophets who speak truth to power. We're also anointed to some degree, at varying levels for us, as kings, people who have power. And the anointing of the prophet is to take your courage, to take up your mantle, to find your voice, and to speak up. You are authorized to speak up when you see injustice. and you are anointed to listen when injustice is being called out around you. And that's a hard one for some of us who are like, yeah, I'm an activist and I'm a justice warrior and I'm like for the right causes. And yet we sometimes need to hear the voices of those around us calling us out, hopefully calling us in. So for many of us, we just don't believe